Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about widgets and variables. And the variable part might be a little head scratchy for you because you already know about variables, I'm sure. But they're a little bit different when we're working with GUIs. But widgets are going to be something that we use every single time we're working on a GUI application. So it's something that's pretty important for us to cover. We're going to talk about what widgets are, the most common widgets that we access, and then variables and what the difference is between a standard variable and a GUI variable. So just moving on to what widgets are, they're really the fundamental building block of GUI applications because it's all made up of visual components of one thing or another. Some of them are visual in the sense that they contain other visuals, but they don't have any like physical thing that you can see, like a frame. But for the most part, they're all going to be things that we can add to our application that is going to get displayed in some way. But they're the way that we provide anything for the user to interact with. And essentially everything from top to bottom is going to be a widget while we're doing GUI development, even the TK class that acts as the root of our application. Some of the most common widgets that we're going to be using throughout this are going to be buttons. And there are a lot of variations of buttons, such as the standard button that we already saw, but then you get the other types of buttons. And a lot of the time you can just think of how this would be on a web form of some kind. You'll have checkboxes, you'll have groups of buttons where you can only select one. That's going to be a radio button. You're going to have menu buttons where you can select them and it opens a little drop down for you. There's a lot of different types of buttons that we can utilize. Labels are going to be the way that we display static things like text and images. And these are pretty common because we're going to want to label the fields that we provide to our user to interact with. A frame is one that we haven't used yet, but it's going to be a subcontainer inside of our application that allows us to group specific widgets together. And so where we had our button and we added it when we created it to the root of our application previously, we could create a frame that is added to the root, and then we could add the button to the frame just to group it together and maybe lay it out a little bit differently. And we're going to use those quite a lot when we start building more complicated layouts in our applications. Entry is going to be the way that we provide text entry. So this is just your standard text input field, and we're going to use this quite a bit. There are also menus, and this allows us to build the context menus that you find when you're running many applications like the file, edit, view, etc. menus. And then the last one here is going to be label frame, which is a little weird, but it's going to be just like a frame where it groups other things, but it allows us to provide it with a name, and then it's going to give it a border that goes around the outside. So you'll sometimes see these in preferences for applications. Now's probably the more interesting thing that we're going to be talking about in this lesson. That's going to be variables versus GUI variables. And we use variables all the time in our code, but if we want those variables to be accessible to the user through the GUI, then we're going to be using objects instead of just standard assignment, if that makes sense. We're going to create an object that kind of has a type. So we'll have string variables and Boolean variables and float and integer variables. And then those will actually be set using methods rather than us just reassigning the name of the variable. So they become mutable options that we can use rather than those exact same basic types make immutable objects for variables behind the scenes. And this allows us some very powerful things because we can actually watch what's going on within our variables and then do things based on that. So we can say, if the contents of this specific variable change, then go execute this function, which might cause a change somewhere else in our application. This is called reactive programming a lot of times. And you'll see this when you're working in a spreadsheet, for instance, where you update cell A3, but then some function in a cell D6 is reliant on A3. And when you change A3, it automatically recalculates what's going on in D6. So we can do those very same things using variables and functions that kind of tie into those things. So I like to think of variable objects like this and the widgets themselves as being the two fundamental things that we're going to be interacting with when we're creating our user interfaces and thinking about how we're going to get data from the user into our application. So if we think about it in that way, it'll kind of make sense when we realize like, okay, I'm going to need this type of field to be on the page, and then I need a variable to be behind that so that I can easily access it or modify what's going on in that field to have a better user experience for the person who's using my GUI application.